I knew something was wrong the moment I heard my name spoken in that hushed, careful tone people use when they think you're already out the door. The conference room was dark except for the sliver of light leaking from the doorway, and I was only passing by to grab a printout. But then I heard it, my manager's voice, low and deliberate, saying they'd finalize the paperwork by Friday. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like missing a step on the stairs. I froze, listening, feeling the air tighten around me. They were planning to fire me. Me, the one who trained half the department, who kept the place running when the network crashed for an entire day, who had just covered two people's workloads for weeks. And they were doing it behind closed doors like I was some disposable intern. The betrayal didn't hit all at once. It was slow, simmering, deliberate, like water inching toward a boil. I walked back to my desk in a daze, but the shock didn't last long. Confusion turned to anger, and anger cooled into something sharp and oddly calm. Because if they were trying to get rid of me, it wasn't for performance. No, this smelled like politics, like the kind of backroom maneuvering that rots under fluorescent lights. And if they wanted to play dirty, well, I had something they didn't know about. Last year, after a string of after-hours thefts in our building, IT installed a network-integrated security system and had me oversee the testing. In the process, I discovered the system didn't just store access logs and hallway footage. It also synced with conference room devices by default, mics included. Management didn't know that. Or maybe they forgot. I didn't. And I still had administrative access. I spent that night at home staring at the ceiling before finally grabbing my laptop and logging into the security dashboard. The timestamp from the moment I'd overheard them was still fresh. I cued the audio feed from that conference room, hands steady, breathing oddly measured. When the file loaded and their voices spilled out, my manager and his little circle whispering about replacing me with someone cheaper and reducing headcount quietly, I felt a cold satisfaction settle into my bones. They weren't just firing me, they were doing it to cover a budgeting mistake they'd made months earlier. They needed a scapegoat. They picked the wrong one. The next morning, I walked into the office earlier than anyone except the janitorial crew. I drafted an email to HR, attaching the audio file and a time-stamped screenshot proving its origin. I laid everything out carefully, the planning, the deception, the clear retaliation for me refusing to approve an unbudgeted software purchase my manager tried sneaking through. I didn't embellish a single word, the truth was damning enough. At the bottom, I added a single sentence: I'd like to schedule a meeting with HR before close of business today. Then I hit send and waited. The reaction didn't take long. By noon, HR had called me in with a tone so overly polite it was almost guilty. They asked me to recount everything. I did. They asked if I still had admin access. I said I did, but I hadn't used it beyond retrieving the recorded meeting. They asked me to step out for a few minutes. Through the thin walls, I could hear someone's footsteps pacing, voices rising, a door slamming. By the time they called me back in, they looked like they'd aged 5 years. My manager was suspended pending investigation. The term policy violations was mentioned more than once. HR thanked me for bringing everything forward, framing me as a responsible employee protecting the company's integrity. Funny, considering I'd nearly been kicked out of it the day before. They offered me 2 weeks of fully paid leave while they sorted things out internally. I didn't argue. When I stepped outside into the parking lot, the cold winter air felt different, lighter, cleaner, like something toxic had finally been cleared out of my lungs. 2 weeks later, I returned to an office that felt eerily polite. My manager's desk was empty. No goodbye email. No farewell cake. Just gone. HR told the team he'd chosen to pursue other opportunities. Sure. And I chose not to broadcast the fact that their little conspiracy had been neatly folded into an investigation report with my name nowhere near the problem column. My revenge wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I didn't want theatrics. I wanted fairness. And that's exactly what they got, by force, if necessary. Now, every time I pass that conference room, I can't help but glance at the door and remember the night they thought they'd get rid of me quietly. They had no idea the walls were listening. But I was. And I made sure they heard me back. Words spread quietly at first, drifting through cubicles the way gossip always does, soft, uncertain, but persistent. People didn't ask me directly what had happened, but their sideways glances said enough. A few coworkers who had barely spoken to me before suddenly went out of their way to be friendly, testing the air around me as if I were carrying some invisible authority now. Maybe I was. When someone walks away from a brush with termination not only unscathed but mysteriously protected, people notice. In an office, survival is its own currency. My first day back, I found a sticky note on my monitor that just said, "Glad you're still here." No signature. The handwriting looked hurried, almost guilty. I peeled it off and stuck it inside my notebook where I kept things worth remembering. By noon, HR had sent a request for me to meet with the interim manager they'd appointed, Mary Ann, a woman known for her calm tone and terrifyingly sharp memory. She was the kind of person who didn't need to raise her voice, silence did most of her work for her. When I walked into her office, she gestured to the chair without looking up from her screen. "I've reviewed your file," she said, typing a final sentence before finally meeting my eyes. "And I've reviewed his." She meant my former manager. The slight pause before the pronoun told me everything I needed to know. "I'm impressed with how you handled yourself." I wasn't sure what to say. Gratitude felt premature. Victory felt dangerous. So I kept my voice neutral. I only reported what happened. "That's exactly why I wanted to speak with you." She closed her laptop and folded her hands. "This department is going to look very different moving forward. And I'd like you involved in building that stability. We need someone who knows the system and isn't afraid of the truth." The words hit harder than I expected, validation where I'd been bracing for suspicion. I left her office with a strange lightness in my step, the kind that comes when the ground you thought was crumbling suddenly steadies under you. But revenge stories never end cleanly. They linger in the small, awkward moments that follow. Like when I ran into Derek, one of the people who had been in that conference room the night they plotted against me. He had always been the sort who smiled too quickly, laughed too loudly, pretended loyalty was the same thing as friendliness. Now, when we crossed paths near the break room, his smile flickered like a dying bulb. "Hey," he said, voice pitched a little too high. "Crazy few weeks, huh?" I held his gaze just long enough to make him uncomfortable. "Seems quieter lately," I said. "More honest." His throat bobbed. He muttered something about needing to get back to work and practically fled down the hallway. I didn't chase the satisfaction that followed, it found me all on its own. Still, the best part came a few days later, when HR circulated a mandatory training email titled, "Ethical Communication and Transparency in Management." Every supervisor in the building was required to attend. I wasn't a manager, but I was CC'd on the notice anyway with a personal note from HR asking if I'd be willing to answer technical questions about the security system. I read the line twice, realizing with a slow, spreading heat that they wanted me, as the subject matter expert for a training that existed because of what happened. Poetic. I sat in the back of the training room during the session, watching the leadership team shift in their uncomfortable plastic chairs as the facilitator emphasized accountability, oversight, and consequences. Some of them looked bored. Others looked nervous. A few kept glancing at me as if I were a walking reminder of what happens when backroom deals aren't as private as they think. By the end of the month, Mary Ann called me in again. She slid a folder across the table and said, simply, "You've earned this." Inside was a promotion. Not a massive one, but unmistakably solid: new title, better pay, and influence over the department's workflow. It wasn't revenge by firestorm. It was revenge by gravity, pulling everything back into balance. Walking out of her office, I felt the old anxiety, the memory of overhearing my own professional death sentence, finally loosen its grip on my spine. I was still here. Stronger. Sharper. And the people who tried to erase me were gone or diminished, their shadows shrinking in the rear view. The office looked the same on the outside: beige walls, humming lights, the faint scent of burnt coffee drifting from the break room. But for me, everything had changed. I'd learned something valuable, something I kept tucked away like a spare key. People plot in dark rooms, whispering like the walls aren't listening. But sometimes the walls remember. And sometimes, if you're patient enough, they speak. The shift in atmosphere didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, like the way a storm clears, first with a hint of blue in one corner of the sky, then a slow widening until the whole horizon brightens. People began stopping by my desk to ask for my opinion on things they never would have a month earlier. Routine tasks I'd been buried under for years were suddenly redistributed, and instead I was being asked to review processes, evaluate gaps, suggest improvements. At first, it felt surreal, like I'd stepped sideways into an alternate version of my own life where my work actually mattered. And then came the day I realized someone else was unraveling because of what had happened. It was late, nearly everyone had gone home. I stayed behind to finish a system audit Marianne had requested. The office at night is a different creature entirely: dim, quiet, humming with the low electrical pulse of servers and vending machines. As I walked toward the break room, I heard a soft, uneven sound, someone muffling their breathing. Rounding the corner, I saw Emily, one of the junior analysts who had always kept to herself. She sat on one of the plastic chairs, head bowed, fingers gripping a half-crumpled tissue. When she realized I'd seen her, she wiped her eyes fast, trying to look composed. "Sorry," she said, voice thick. "I'll go. I just needed a minute." "You're fine," I said gently. "Just sit." "What happened?" She hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. "I was in one of his meetings," she said. She didn't have to specify who he was. My former manager's name hung in the room without being spoken. He used to pressure us. He'd tell us to approve things we weren't comfortable with. He'd say it was for the good of the department. Her hands trembled. I didn't know it was okay to say no. Something cold settled in my chest. This wasn't just office politics. He hadn't just targeted me because I stood in his way. He'd been quietly manipulating and intimidating people for years, and no one had ever called him on it. Until now. "You're safe," I told her, meaning it. "Things are changing. You're allowed to do your job without being afraid." She nodded, swallowing hard. "Everyone knows, you were the reason he's gone." There wasn't awe in her voice, there was relief. "Thank you." After she left, I stood alone in that quiet break room, staring at the faint reflection of myself in the vending machine glass. I hadn't meant to become anything more than someone trying to protect my job. But somewhere along the way, I'd become something else: a disruption. A catalyst. A reminder that people like him weren't untouchable. Over the next few weeks, the department found its rhythm again, but it was a different rhythm: steady, open, collaborative. Mistakes were admitted without fear. Decisions were explained instead of dictated. I watched people lift their heads more often, speak a little freer, breathe easier. And every once in a while, I'd catch someone glancing at the conference rooms with a flicker of memory, the way you look at a place where lightning once struck. Then came the final twist, subtle, almost poetic. One morning, IT sent a company-wide notice: Audio syncing on conference room devices has been permanently disabled pending a security review. Employees shrugged. Managers grumbled. But the people who had been in that original meeting, the ones who had tried to erase me, they would have understood exactly why that policy changed. A silent acknowledgement. A quiet consequence. And in a way, it was perfect. Their scheme had begun in that room. And that room had been the thing that ended them. Sometimes justice isn't loud or cinematic. Sometimes it's a ripple, small, inevitable, carrying just enough force to remind everyone that quiet harm can still have very loud fallout. I didn't ask for power. I didn't chase it. But once I understood the weight of my own voice, the voice they tried to silence, I decided something with absolute clarity. If the walls ever started whispering again, I'd be ready to listen. Spring crept in slowly, softening the sharp edges winter had left behind. With it came a strange sense of normalcy, the kind that feels earned rather than assumed. I settled into my new role with a steady confidence, and for the first time in a long while, walking into the office didn't feel like bracing for impact. But one thing about revenge, real revenge, is that its aftershocks don't always end where you expect them to. Sometimes they echo. It was on a Thursday morning, quiet enough that you could hear the fluorescent lights buzz, when I noticed something unusual. A cardboard box sat on my desk, not the cheap, flimsy kind our supply room stocked, but the heavy-duty sort movers use. No label. No note. Inside, packed neatly, were folders. Not mine. His. My former manager's. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Someone in records must have mixed things up. But when I lifted the top folder, a sticky note fluttered out, stuck to my wrist. You should see this. No signature again, but the handwriting this time was steady, almost deliberate. Inside the folders were documents, emails he'd printed, budgets he'd edited, proposals he'd manipulated. Shadows of all the ways he'd twisted things to build his little kingdom of quiet control. And between the pages, tucked like confessions, were notes written by employees, anonymous messages describing moments he'd cornered them, pressured them, dismissed them. None of it had ever been reported. Fear is a terrible silencer. Someone, somewhere in the building, had decided that I should be the one to see what he'd left behind. I spent an hour sifting through it, the pieces fitting together like a puzzle no one had wanted to complete. Some of it was genuinely incriminating, blatant misuse of funds, buried approval requests, message threads showing how he pitted coworkers against each other to keep them compliant. But mixed with that were personal notes, scraps of his handwriting, reminders to himself that said things like no weaknesses and control perception. It struck me that he hadn't just been manipulative. He'd been afraid. Desperately so. Afraid of being found out. Afraid of being overshadowed. Afraid of losing the one thing he thought made him matter. And that fear had shaped everything he'd done, including trying to erase me before I could expose him. I closed the last folder and exhaled slowly. This wasn't just evidence. It was residue. The fallout of a man who built his entire career on the belief that no one would ever challenge him. I carried the box down to HR, knocking lightly before stepping in. Marianne looked up from her screen, her expression sharpening when she saw what I held. They were on my desk, I said. Someone wanted me to see them. She nodded once, not surprised, almost expecting it. We've been gathering information for the final report, she said. This will help. But before she took the box, she paused, fingertips resting on the cardboard edge. You know, she said softly, what you did helped more people than you realize. Sometimes a single voice breaks a whole pattern. Her eyes held something warm, something unwavering. You didn't just expose a problem. You changed the culture. I didn't know what to say. Praise still felt strange, like wearing a shirt a size too big. but I nodded, leaving the box with her. Later that afternoon, as I walked back from the break room with a fresh cup of coffee, I caught a familiar reflection in the glass of the stairwell door, Emily, talking with another analyst, her posture straighter than I'd ever seen it. She laughed at something he said. Not nervously. Not apologetically. Just freely. That's when it hit me. Revenge had stopped being personal the moment others began to stand taller because of it. As I passed the conference rooms, the same walls that had once held the quiet conspiracy meant to end me, I felt the old memory rise again, but it wasn't heavy anymore. Not sharp. Not painful. It was just a reminder. People think power is loud, dramatic, announced. They forget that sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's simply refusing to disappear. And sometimes, when someone tries to bury you in silence, you come back with a voice they can't ignore, one that shifts an entire building's gravity. Revenge doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like walking through the same door they thought would be your exit, and knowing it will never be theirs again. By summer, the office felt like a place I didn't just work in, but one I finally understood, its hidden currents, its old ghosts, and the parts of it worth fighting for. The whispers had faded, replaced by a steady hum of people doing their jobs without glancing over their shoulders. There were new boundaries, new standards, and subtle but unmistakable shifts in the way decisions were made. It wasn't perfect, no workplace ever is, but it was honest in a way it hadn't been before. One afternoon, as sunlight angled across my desk, I found myself thinking back to that night, the overheard conversation, the cold twist of dread, the quiet fury that set everything into motion. It felt distant now, like a scene from a life I'd stepped out of. Not forgotten, just finished. I didn't become a hero. I didn't become a vigilante. And I didn't destroy anyone for the sake of destruction. I simply refused to let myself be erased. That decision, small, instinctive, almost desperate, had rippled outward in ways I never planned. People found their courage. The system found its cracks and began to mend. And I found something I didn't expect, a sense of control over my own story again. Revenge, I realized, isn't always fire and spectacle. Sometimes it's steadier, quieter, like the click of a lock turning, like the certainty of a door closing behind the person who meant you harm. It's the long, patient work of reclaiming what someone tried to take from you. Months later, whenever I walked past that same conference room, the memory no longer tightened my chest. Instead, it reminded me of this simple truth: people may try to write your ending in private. But the moment you decide to speak, really speak, you take the pen back. And sometimes, taking the pen is the greatest revenge of all.